Well, we're in a Cold War again, aren't we? But arguably even worse, because if you look now, there's apparent sabotage going on, and that's a pretty direct threat, isn't it? My name is George Grylls. I'm defence correspondent for The Times. Last week, a Russian, what is officially called an oceanographic research vessel, but if I told you that, for example, it spent a lot of its time, for example, hanging off the coast of Guantanamo Bay, hanging around lots of undersea cables around the British Isles, that might give you a better picture of what it actually does, which is what basically the Royal Navy thinks it does, which is it's a Russian spy ship. And this Russian spy ship turned up off the coast of the British Isles, not the first time that it had done so, and entered Britain's exclusive economic zone, at which point the Royal Navy gently shepherded it away from British waters up through the Channel and up out of the North Sea, and the RAF deployed maritime patrol aircraft to basically monitor exactly what it was doing, because basically British patience had snapped. This was not the first time that it had come to the UK, and it had snapped to the extent that the Defence Secretary took the kind of unusual step of going to MPs to announce what had happened and deliver a strong message to Putin and say, we see you, we know what you're up to, and we're not going to stand for it.
George, what happened last week wasn't the first time we've seen Russian spy ships turning up in British waters. How common is this, and how long has it been going on?
I think you can date this back to the Cold War, to be honest. If you think about where Britain is on a map, it is basically at the entrance to the Atlantic, as far as Russia is concerned. So if Russia wants to get to the Atlantic, it has to basically pass the UK. And there's something called the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap, which is this kind of stretch of water, which is Russia's entrance to the Atlantic, and constantly the Royal Navy's job has been, since the Cold War, basically, to patrol that and to work out what Russian submarines, what Russian warships are kind of passing through there. So it's not uncommon for Soviet ships, even back in the day, to pass through near the British Isles. I think what is a new phenomenon is the loitering of Russian spy ships around critical underseas infrastructure, and the fact that Britain appears to be taking a slightly more robust approach to that. So in November, the Yantar, which was the same ship that was involved in this incident last week, actually came again to Britain, was hovering near critical underwater infrastructure, telecommunications cables, pipelines, and the Royal Navy kind of took the decision to actually surface a nuclear-powered attack submarine, HMS Astute, right next to the spy ship, and they delivered them a message saying, well, they literally said good morning, which is all they needed to say, because it's basically telling them, we're watching you, we know what you're up to.
That must have been quite the shock to see a submarine turning up next to you. And it's an unusual move because they're usually very, very secretive.
Yeah, it might surprise listeners to know, but a lot of these things are quite coordinated. So if you think, for example, in the air, if Russian fighter jets are kind of approaching NATO airspace, then everyone kind of knows the dance that follows. NATO scrambles some airplanes, they go up, they say, we're watching you, they turn around and go back. So often these sorts of kind of military moves are pretty coordinated, but there does seem to be a kind of step up, certainly in the maritime domain, of nervousness about underseas infrastructure, and therefore taking a slightly more aggressive approach towards Russian ships that kind of approach the UK.
And that feels different too. So, as you say, the Yantar, this Russian spy ship, turned up in November. It was back again last week. And really unusually, we had the Defence Secretary standing up in Parliament and talking about it, going very public about what was happening in a way that they hadn't in November, for example, and delivering a real message. Just tell us what he's been doing, how he's dealing with the threat.
Well, the attraction to hostile actors, namely Russia and China, is that this is quite often deniable. It's very hard to prove, for example, that a submarine cable or an infrastructure that has been damaged has been done so deliberately and that it wasn't an accident. And so, therefore, if you want to cause huge economic harm to the West and to the UK, you can do so potentially in a way where it doesn't get traced back to you. So all of the NATO response has been, and why this submarine surfaced right there, is basically to try and remove that and be able to pinpoint exactly who was responsible for breaking what cable and hopefully deter countries from attacking that infrastructure by having very credible proof that it's them who's responsible.
And to call it out in Parliament in that way feels very unusual too. And I understand he's even changed the rules of engagement. Tell us what that means.
Yeah, I think that's when you can actually use a submarine. Usually you wouldn't use a submarine against, for example, a research vessel, but I guess it sends a bit of a message, doesn't it? If you have a nuclear-powered attack submarine surfacing right next to you, that's the kind of it's intimidation, isn't it? Really,
George, you're a defence correspondent. You watch the risks to security on a daily basis. You've been to the Baltic Sea. You've seen this up close. Is this the new battlefront we should all be worried about? Is this the place where we're vulnerable, where we're quite exposed?
It's one of them. I think you would also include in that satellites, and could we be cut off from if you think about how modern economies work, they rely on me being able to send an email and you being able to go on the internet to buy this or deliver that, and all that sort of logistics is powered through undersea cables. So it's attacking that, but also it relies on satellites, and all kind of major powers are investing in their space capabilities, testing missiles that could take out satellites. So that would be another area where you would see, you would kind of want to invest to potentially protect yourself. But then also, if you cast your mind back to the summer, there were those incidents with delivery packages exploding at airports, and that...
DHL planes.
DHL planes, exactly.
Lithuania and places like that.
Exactly. And Donald Tusk only last week was saying this is Russian terrorism. They are aiming to take out planes, transatlantic planes, using delivery packages. So that's another way in which you could kind of interrupt economies and logistics, not to mention the, loss of life, but potentially another deniable form of attack similar to those underwater cables.
And George, how seriously should we take the threat from Russia now? Are we getting to a point where it feels like we're entering the stage of a war?
Well, we're in a Cold War again, aren't we? But arguably even worse, because if you look now, there's apparent sabotage going on, and that's a pretty direct threat, isn't it? It's a really, really dangerous moment.
That's The Story from The Times and The Sunday Times. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.